He is the pharaoh of a majestic empire, bound to a marriage that would seal a sacred alliance and strengthen his dynasty's power. She, a woman who lost everything, forced to live in the shadows of Thebes, trying to erase a past she could never reclaim. When fate brings them together after years of separation, the flame of a forbidden love reignites with overwhelming intensity, defying not only the court and the gods, but destiny itself. The morning sun cast long golden fingers across the alabaster floors of the royal palace, catching the gem-studded collar around young Ramses's neck. He stood motionless at the balcony overlooking the sprawling city of Thebes, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of the royal mantle. Though barely 20 summers old, the responsibility of ruling Kemet, the Black Land, as his people called it, already etched lines around his eyes that shouldn't belong on one so young. "Your Majesty," the soft voice of his advisor Pentu broke through his thoughts. "The envoy from Kush awaits your presence in the throne room." Ramses sighed, a sound so deeply private that it seemed out of place coming from one who was worshipped as a living god. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," he murmured, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon where the desert met the sky. "I'm afraid they've been waiting since sunrise, my lord," Pentu pressed gently. The old man had served Ramses' father before him and was perhaps the only person in the palace who still saw the young ruler as the child he once was. "The matter of your marriage cannot be delayed much longer. The Nile rises, and with it, the expectations of your people. Marriage." The word hung in the air like a blade. Ramses closed his eyes, feeling the cool morning breeze against his freshly shaven face. A face that, according to tradition, would soon be paired with that of Princess Ankhesen of Kush, a woman he had never met, whose voice he had never heard, whose laughter or tears or dreams remained as foreign to him as the distant lands beyond the cataracts. "I know my duty, Pentu," Ramses finally said, turning to face his advisor. The old man's eyes softened with understanding and perhaps a hint of pity. "I know what I must do for Kemet, for my father's legacy. For the unification of our lands," Pentu bowed his head in acknowledgement. "It is not just about the marriage, my lord. The alliance with Kush will bring stability to our southern borders. Their gold mines will fill our treasuries, and their warriors will bolster our armies. In these uncertain times, with the Hittites pressing from the north and whispers of unrest from within, such security cannot be undervalued." The young pharaoh nodded, his face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the storm brewing within. He had been raised since birth to put the needs of his kingdom before his own desires. To be pharaoh was not to be a man. It was to be a vessel for Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. "Have the royal barge prepared," Ramses commanded, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had practiced since childhood. "We will travel upriver to meet the princess of Kush." "It is time I saw my future bride with my own eyes." Pentu's face brightened. "A wise decision, your majesty. I shall make the arrangements immediately." As the advisor hurried away, Ramses returned his gaze to the city below. The markets were coming alive, tiny figures moving like ants between the mud-brick buildings. Farmers brought their produce on donkeys, craftsmen opened their workshops, and priests made their way to the temples for morning rituals. They were his people, all of them, from the highest noble to the lowest servant, and for them he would sacrifice his heart's desire. Whatever that might have been, had he ever been allowed to discover it. "My son," came a deeper voice from the chamber entrance. Ramses turned to see his father, the former pharaoh who had stepped aside due to illness, but remained as regent until Ramses' marriage. Though frail, the older man still carried himself with the dignity of one who had ruled the most powerful kingdom on earth. "Father," Ramses acknowledged with a respectful nod, "I've decided to journey to meet Princess Ankhesen." The former pharaoh's face crinkled with approval. "You do your lineage proud, my son. This union will cement your rule and bring prosperity to our people for generations to come." He approached slowly, leaning on his walking stick of polished ebony. When he reached Ramses, he placed a gnarled hand on his son's shoulder. "I know this is not the path your heart would choose, were you a common man, but you were born for greatness, my son. The blood of gods flows through your veins." Ramses lowered his eyes, unable to meet his father's gaze. "And what of happiness, father? Do gods not deserve joy as well?" The old pharaoh's expression softened. "Happiness comes in many forms, my son. The adoration of your people, the knowledge that you have fulfilled your sacred duty, the children you will sire to continue our divine lineage." He paused, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "And in time, perhaps even affection may grow between you and the princess." Before Ramses could respond, A commotion arose from the palace gates. Guards shouted, and the sound of running feet echoed through the corridors. "Your Majesties!" A captain of the palace guard appeared at the doorway, breathless. "Forgive the intrusion, but the envoy from Kush brings unexpected news." Ramses straightened, sensing a shift in the winds of fate. "Speak." "Princess Ankhesen has arrived in Thebes ahead of schedule. Her barge now approaches the royal dock. She requests an immediate audience." The old pharaoh's eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with calculation. "Bold," he murmured. "Very bold of her to arrive unannounced." Ramses felt his heart quicken, though whether from anxiety or some other emotion he couldn't say. "Then we shall receive her," he declared, gesturing for his attendants to bring his formal regalia. "If the princess is eager to hasten our union, who am I to keep destiny waiting?" As servants rushed to prepare him for the unexpected royal meeting, Ramses caught a glimpse of his reflection in a polished copper mirror. The face that stared back at him was not just his own, but that of every pharaoh who had come before. A face bound by tradition, by duty, by the unbreakable chains of divine purpose. Little did he know that elsewhere in the great city of Thebes, another face from his past was about to re-enter his life, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about destiny, duty, and his own heart's desires. The great Plaza of Thebes bustled with life under the scorching midday sun. Merchants hawked their wares from colorful stalls, the air thick with the mingling scents of spices, incense, and humanity. Children darted between the legs of shoppers, their laughter rising above the steady hum of commerce. It was here, amid the heartbeat of his kingdom, that Ramses sought momentary escape from the suffocating formality of court life. "Your Majesty, this is most irregular," whispered Meritaten, the chief of his personal guard, her eyes constantly scanning the crowds for potential threats. "The Princess of Kush awaits you in the palace. The priests have already begun preparations for your first formal meeting." Ramses waved a dismissive hand, though he'd taken care to dress in simple linens, a hood partially concealing his face. Even so, a respectful hush followed in his wake as people recognized their living god walking among them. "The princess can wait a little longer," he replied, breathing in the vibrant chaos of ordinary life. "I needed to see my people, to remind myself why I do what I must do." Meritaten's expression softened momentarily before returning to professional vigilance. "As you wish, my pharaoh, but we cannot linger." Ramses nodded absently, his attention drawn to a weaver's stall near the edge of the plaza. Several women worked there, their nimble fingers transforming threads into fine cloth before the admiring eyes of potential buyers. One woman in particular caught his eye, her head bent over an intricate pattern of lotus flowers blooming against a background of river reeds. Her hands moved with practiced grace, but there was something more in the tilt of her neck, the curve of her shoulders. The pharaoh froze mid-step, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs like the drums of war. "It cannot be," he whispered, so softly that even Meritaten didn't hear. But it was. As if sensing his gaze, the woman looked up, and time itself seemed to stand still. Though leaner than he remembered, with cheekbones more prominent beneath sun-darkened skin, he would know those eyes anywhere, deep as the night sky, and just as full of stars. Eyes that had once looked at him with childish adoration as they raced through palace gardens, stealing sweet dates from the kitchen and sharing secrets beneath the shade of sycamore trees. "Nephara," her name escaped his lips like a prayer. Her eyes widened in recognition, and the reed shuttle slipped from her fingers, clattering to the ground. For one breathless moment, something like joy flickered across her face, but it vanished so quickly that Ramses wondered if he'd imagined it, replaced by an expression so carefully blank it could only be deliberate. Without thinking, Ramses moved toward her, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea before Moses. Meritaten hissed a warning, but he couldn't hear anything over the roaring in his ears. Memories flooded back, of summer afternoons by the Nile, of whispered dreams beneath a canopy of stars, of a girl who had once known him as just Ramses, not as pharaoh or living god. "Nephara," he said again, louder this time, standing before her humble stall. The other weavers had fallen to their knees in deference, foreheads pressed to the ground. Only Nephara remained seated, her fingers now white-knuckled as they gripped the cloth in her lap. "Forgive her, Divine One," an older weaver woman frantically apologized, tugging at Nephara's sleeve. "She is new to our guild and doesn't know proper—" "Leave us," Ramses commanded, his voice gentle but brooking no argument. The other weavers scrambled away, casting fearful glances back at their companion, who dared to look upon the face of a god. When they were relatively alone as one could be in the bustling plaza with guards standing at a respectful distance, Ramses sank to his knees before her, an action so shocking that gasps rippled through the watching crowd. A pharaoh kneeling before a common craftswoman. Tomorrow the gossip would spread through Thebes like wildfire. "Do my eyes deceive me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, is it truly you?" Nefer's face remained impassive, though something flickered in her eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," she said, her voice husky but controlled. "You must be mistaking me for someone else." The formal address stung worse than any physical blow. Ramses leaned closer, searching her face. "Nefer, daughter of Senenmut, who once climbed the tallest tree in the palace garden to rescue my pet falcon. Who taught me to swim against the current when we were forbidden to leave the palace grounds? Who gave me this?" He pulled a small amulet from beneath his simple tunic, a carved scarab beetle of lapis lazuli, strung on a leather cord, worn thin with age. A tremor passed through Nefer's body, so slight that only someone watching as intently as Ramses would notice. Her eyes fixed on the amulet, and for a moment, the careful mask slipped. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this." "What happened to you?" Ramses asked, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away as if his touch might burn her. "Your father was my own tutor. You were raised alongside me in the palace. Then one day, you were both gone without explanation. I searched. My father is dead," Nefer cut in, her voice suddenly sharp as a blade. Her eyes darted around, noticing the growing crowd of onlookers. "And that girl you remember died with him." The coldness in her voice made Ramses physically recoil. This was not the Nefer of his childhood memories, the laughing girl with wild ideas and a heart full of dreams. "I don't understand," he said, confusion and hurt evident in his voice. "Whatever happened, whatever hardship you've endured, let me help you. Come back to the palace, your rightful place." "My rightful place," Nefer interrupted, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "My rightful place is exactly where I am, Pharaoh. A commoner, a weaver of cloth, nothing more." She gestured to her weathered hands, calloused from years of labor. "These hands tell my true story now." Ramses felt as though he'd been plunged into the Nile during flood season, struggling to make sense of the current's direction. "Nefer, please." "The palace guard approaches, Your Majesty," Merituten warned, stepping closer with a hand on her weapon. Indeed, more royal guards were pushing through the crowd, summoned by the unusual spectacle of their pharaoh kneeling in the dust. Nefer stood abruptly, gathering her weaving tools with efficient movements. "You should return to your palace, Divine One, to your princess from Kush, to your destiny." Her voice softened almost imperceptibly as she added, "Some paths cannot be retraced once they've diverged." Before Ramses could respond, she bowed, a proper, formal bow of a subject to her sovereign, and stepped backward, melting into the crowd of weavers who had been watching from a distance. "Wait!" Ramses called, rising to his feet, but the press of his guards around him created a barrier, and Nefer was gone, swallowed by the sea of people in the plaza. "Your Majesty, we must return to the palace immediately," his chief guard insisted, concern etched on her face. "Your absence has been noticed." "The princess's entourage is most displeased." Ramses barely heard her, his eyes still searching the crowd for a glimpse of Nefer. His mind reeled with questions. What tragedy had befallen her family? Why did she look at him with such ice in her eyes, when once they had been inseparable? "Find her," he murmured to Merituten. "Discover where she lives, but do not approach her. Just watch over her." The guard captain hesitated, then nodded. "As you command, Divine One." As Ramses allowed himself to be escorted back toward the palace, he clutched the lapis scarab amulet in his fist, its edges digging into his palm. The simple trinket, a childhood gift from a girl who had once looked at him and seen just Ramses, not the living embodiment of Horus on earth, now felt like the only real thing in a world suddenly thrown off its axis. Behind him, in the shadows of a doorway, Nefer watched his retreat, one hand pressed against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Only when he had disappeared from sight did she allow a single tear to trace its way down her cheek, quickly wiped away before anyone could witness such weakness. "Forgive me, Ramses," she whispered into the uncaring air. "Some loves are too dangerous to rekindle." Night had fallen over Thebes, but sleep eluded Ramses as he paced the moonlit terraces of his private chambers. The day's events replayed in his mind like scenes from a fever dream. Princess Ankhesen's formal arrival with her entourage of nobles and servants, the elaborate greeting ceremony where he'd performed his duties like a wooden puppet, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, with a weaver in the marketplace. "You seem troubled, Divine One," came a soft voice from the doorway. Pentu, his aged advisor, stood with a small bronze cup of warm, honeyed milk. "I thought this might help you find rest." Ramses accepted the drink with a distracted nod. "The princess is everything the reports claimed. Beautiful, well-spoken, politically astute. Yet your mind wanders elsewhere," Pentu observed, his knowing eyes missing nothing. He had known Ramses since the day of his birth and could read the young pharaoh's moods like a scribe reads hieroglyphs. Ramses turned away, gazing out at the silver ribbon of the Nile gleaming under the full moon. "I saw her today, Pentu, in the marketplace." There was no need to specify who her was. Pentu's sharp intake of breath confirmed he understood immediately. "Nephara," the old man whispered, the name hanging in the air between them like an unspoken prayer. "After all these years, I had thought her family line extinguished." "Not extinguished," Ramses said, his voice tightening. "Merely reduced to poverty and common labor. She works as a weaver now, her hands rough from toil when they once played the harp so beautifully that even my father said the gods themselves must listen with envy." He turned to face his advisor, eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and determination. "What happened to them, Pentu? One day they were here, integral to palace life, and the next, vanished, their names forbidden to be spoken. Even as a child I knew something was terribly wrong." Pentu's weathered face creased with old sorrow. "It is not my place to—" "I am no longer a child to be shielded from ugly truths," Ramses interrupted, his voice carrying the edge of command that was becoming more natural to him with each passing day. "I am Pharaoh now. Tell me what happened to Senenmut and his daughter." The old advisor sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if to ease the pressure of long-buried memories. "There was an accusation, treason, conspiracy with foreign powers. Your father's chief military commander claimed to have evidence that Senenmut was corresponding with the Hittites." "Impossible," Ramses snapped. "Senenmut was the most loyal man I've ever known. He taught me the very meaning of devotion to Kemet." "I agree," Pentu said quietly. "But the evidence was compelling. Fabricated, I always suspected, but convincing nonetheless. Your father was forced to act, and so he banished them rather than executing them as the law would demand." Ramses finished, the pieces falling into place. "He knew Senenmut was innocent." Pentu nodded slowly. Banishment to the outer provinces was the mercy he could grant his old friend without appearing weak. But the disgrace, it broke Senenmut. I heard rumors he died within a year. Ramses closed his eyes, grief washing over him anew for the man who had taught him to read and write, to calculate the stars' movements, to understand the sacred duty of kingship, and for the girl who had been his closest companion, suddenly torn from his world without even a chance to say goodbye. "I must see her again," he declared abruptly, setting down the untouched cup of milk. "Tonight." Pentu's eyes widened in alarm. "Your Majesty, I must strongly advise against this. Princess Ankhesen is already unsettled by your distraction during today's ceremonies. To further complicate matters, by seeking out this woman from your past." "I don't seek to complicate anything," Ramses interrupted. "I seek the truth, justice for a loyal servant of the crown whose name was falsely maligned and—" He hesitated. "I need to understand why Nephara looked at me with such coldness when once we shared everything." Before Pentu could offer further objections, Ramses was already summoning Meritaten. "You found where she lives?" he asked the captain of his guard. Meritaten nodded, though her expression betrayed her disapproval. "A small dwelling near the Weavers' district, Your Majesty. Humble but neat. She lives alone." "Take me there," Ramses commanded, already reaching for the simple cloak he had worn to the marketplace. "Just you, no other guards." An hour later, under cover of darkness, the Pharaoh of all Egypt stood before a modest mud brick house, its single window glowing with the warm light of an oil lamp. Meritaten positioned herself discreetly in the shadows nearby, hand on her sword, vigilant as always. Ramses hesitated, suddenly unsure. What right did he have to intrude upon her life? Yet the memory of her eyes and the pain he'd glimpsed beneath her cold facade compelled him forward. He knocked softly on the wooden door. Time stretched like honey dripping from a comb before the door creaked open. Nephara stood framed in the doorway, a simple reed brush in her hand, her hair loose around her shoulders as if she'd been preparing for bed. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with something between anger and fear. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, glancing nervously at the empty street. Have you lost your mind? If anyone sees you, may I come in? Ramses asked quietly. Please, Nephara. Just a few moments of your time. She hesitated, conflict etched across her features before stepping aside with obvious reluctance. As soon as Ramses crossed the threshold, she closed the door firmly behind him. The interior of her home was as humble as its exterior suggested. A single room with a sleeping mat, a small table holding a clay lamp, and a loom in the corner where her day's work lay half-finished. Yet despite its simplicity, the space held touches of grace. A carefully arranged pot of flowering herbs by the window, a small statuette of Bastet on a shelf, walls freshly whitewashed and adorned with a simple, elegant pattern of lotus flowers. You shouldn't be here, Nephara said, standing with her arms crossed, maintaining a careful distance. What would your court say if they knew their divine pharaoh was visiting a disgraced commoner in the dead of night? I don't care what they would say, Ramses replied, his voice soft but intense. I know what happened to your father, Nephara. The false accusations, the banishment. I'm so sorry. Sorry? Nephara cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. You're sorry? Where was your sorrow when my father was dragged from the palace in chains? Where was your concern when we were forced to travel to the outer provinces with nothing but the clothes on our backs? Where were you when he died, broken and humiliated, still protesting his innocence with his last breath? Each question struck Ramses like a physical blow. I was a child, he whispered. I was told nothing. I searched for you. You were the crown prince. Nephara's composure finally shattered, years of buried grief and rage boiling to the surface. You had the ear of the most powerful man in the world. If you had truly cared, you could have found us. You could have at least asked questions. Ramses fell to his knees before her, overwhelmed by the truth of her words. The weight of her accusation and his own guilt pressed down upon him until he could hardly breathe. You're right, he choked out, his forehead nearly touching the packed earth floor. I failed you. I failed your father. There is no excuse. The sight of the pharaoh, living embodiment of the gods, ruler of the mightiest empire on earth, kneeling in the dust of her humble home seemed to drain the fury from Nephara. She stepped back, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Please get up, she said quietly. You shouldn't kneel to anyone, let alone me. I would kneel before the gods themselves to undo the wrong that was done to you, Ramses said, raising his eyes to meet hers. Tell me how to make this right, Nephara. Let me restore your family's honor, return you to your rightful place. My rightful place? Nephara laughed, the sound brittle as dried reeds. That girl who belonged in the palace died years ago, Ramses. She died watching her father waste away in grief and shame. She died working in the fields until her hands bled to earn enough food to survive. She died learning that the promises of kings are as substantial as morning mist on the Nile. She moved to the small window, staring out at the night sky as if seeking answers in the stars. I've built a life here, simple but mine. I answer to no one. I depend on no one's favor or whim. And you're happy? Ramses asked softly. Nephara turned back to him, her expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. Happiness is a luxury, Pharaoh. I settled for survival. She paused, then added more gently. As I hear you're soon to marry the Princess of Kush, is that happiness or survival of a different kind? The question hung between them, weighted with all that could never be said aloud. Ramses rose to his feet slowly, feeling older than his years. I have duties I cannot escape, he admitted, but I also have power now. Power to right old wrongs. Let me clear your father's name. Let me restore— No, Nephara said firmly, shaking her head. Stirring up the past will only bring more pain, more scrutiny. I've made my peace with what happened. Have you? Ramses challenged, stepping closer. Then why do you look at me with such anguish in your eyes? The same anguish I feel whenever I remember— Don't, she whispered, raising a hand as if to physically ward off his words. Some memories are better left buried, Ramses, for both our sakes. A knock at the door made them both start. Meritaten's voice came, urgent but controlled. Your Majesty, we must leave. Palace guards are patrolling the district. Ramses hesitated, 1,000 unspoken words crowding his throat. This isn't finished, Nephara. I won't simply walk away again. Yes, you will, she replied, her voice steady despite the sheen of tears in her eyes. You have a kingdom to rule, a princess to marry, a dynasty to continue, and I have cloth to weave by morning. Our paths diverged long ago, Pharaoh. Let them remain separate. As if to emphasize her point, she moved to the door and opened it, a clear dismissal. Ramses paused beside her, close enough to catch the familiar scent of lotus flowers that still clung to her hair after all these years. "The girl I knew never accepted defeat so easily," he murmured. "The boy I knew never had to choose between his heart and his crown," she countered, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. With a heavy heart, Ramses stepped out into the night, the door closing firmly behind him. But as Meritaten led him back toward the palace, its golden spires gleaming in the moonlight, he clutched the lapis scarab amulet beneath his robes and made a silent vow. This story was far from over. Meanwhile, alone in her small home, Nephara slid down against the closed door, finally allowing the tears she'd held back to flow freely. From a hidden compartment beneath a loose brick in her floor, she withdrew a small wooden box. Inside lay a child's drawing on papyrus, two stick figures holding hands beneath a crudely drawn sun, labeled in a child's careful script, "Ramses and Nephara forever." "Fool," she whispered to herself, though whether she meant Ramses or herself, even she couldn't say. Princess Ankesen of Kush stood motionless on the balcony of her guest quarters, watching the sky blush pink with dawn. She had been awake for hours, her mind churning with calculations as complex as any battlefield strategy. 3 days she had been in Thebes, and for 3 days, her intended husband had been a ghost, present in body during official functions, but absent in spirit. "The report you requested, Your Highness," came a silky voice behind her. Ankesen didn't turn, keeping her gaze fixed on the awakening city below. "Speak, Nehesi." The man stepped forward, a slender figure with eyes as sharp as a falcon's. Though he wore the simple garb of a Kush nobleman, his true role as Ankesen's spy master was known only to a select few. "The pharaoh visited a woman in the weavers' district again last night," Nehesi said, his voice carefully neutral. "A commoner named Nephara, daughter of Senenmut, once the royal tutor, later disgraced for alleged treason." Ankesen's fingers tightened on the stone balustrade, though her face remained serene. "Alleged? Indeed. My inquiries suggest the accusations were manufactured. The true motive appears to have been rivalry between Senenmut and General Horemheb, who later became the previous pharaoh's right hand." "Interesting," Ankesen murmured, finally turning to face her loyal servant. Though only 24, the princess carried herself with the assurance of a woman twice her age. Her skin, several shades darker than the typical Egyptians, gleamed like polished ebony in the early morning light. She wore no makeup yet, her natural beauty unadorned and all the more striking for it. "And this woman, what is she to our pharaoh?" Nehesi's lips curved in the barest suggestion of a smile. They were childhood companions before her family's disgrace. Some of the older palace servants whisper they were inseparable, the crown prince and the tutor's daughter, running wild through the royal gardens, sharing secrets, growing perhaps too close for propriety. "A childhood infatuation then," Ankesen said dismissively, though her dark eyes glittered with calculation. "Perhaps more," Nehesi suggested. "The pharaoh was observed kneeling before her in the marketplace, a shocking gesture that has set the entire city gossiping. And last night's visit lasted nearly an hour." A muscle twitched in Ankesen's jaw, the only sign that this information disturbed her perfect composure. "Show me this woman." An hour later, disguised in the simple dress of a Kushite handmaiden, Princess Ankesen sat beneath the awning of a date seller's stall, sipping watered wine and observing the weaver's workshop across the plaza. Nehesi, dressed as a common guard, stood nearby, his presence reassuring though unnecessary. Ankesen had been trained in combat since childhood and carried 3 concealed daggers beneath her plain linen dress. "That's her," Nehesi murmured, nodding toward a slender woman arranging bolts of freshly dyed cloth outside the workshop. Ankesen studied her rival with the cool assessment of a general surveying an opposing army. Nephara was beautiful, yes, but in an understated way that required no cosmetics or jewels to enhance. Her movements were graceful despite her common labor, and there was a quiet dignity in the set of her shoulders. Most telling was the way other merchants deferred to her slightly, despite her humble status, a natural authority that couldn't be taught or bought. "I see why he's drawn to her," Ankesen admitted grudgingly. "She carries herself like royalty fallen on hard times, not like someone born to servitude." "Because she wasn't," Nehesi replied. "Until age 12, she was raised in the palace, educated alongside the crown prince, treated almost as a member of the royal family due to her father's favored position." Ankesen sipped her wine thoughtfully. "And yet now she weaves cloth for a living, while I have brought 40 ships laden with gold, ebony and ivory as my dowry." She set down her cup with a decisive click. The comparison should be laughable, yet I find I'm not amused. What would you have me do, Your Highness? Nehesi asked, his hand instinctively moving to the knife concealed at his waist. Ankerson shot him a sharp look. Nothing so crude as what you're thinking. This requires finesse. She rose gracefully, adjusting her simple headscarf. Return to the palace. I will handle this personally. Your Highness, I must advise against... Your concern is noted. She cut him off with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. But I didn't become heir to the Kushite throne by hiding behind my guards. Before Nehesi could protest further, Ankerson was gliding across the marketplace, her bearing so regal that despite her simple attire, people unconsciously moved out of her path. She approached the weaver's stall with the confidence of someone accustomed to having every door opened before them. These are lovely, she commented, running her fingers over a bolt of blue linen so fine it felt like water. Your work? Nefara looked up, momentarily startled before offering a polite shopkeeper's smile. Yes, dyed with true indigo from the southern lands, not the cheaper woad most use. I can tell the difference, Ankerson replied, switching from Egyptian to the trade language of the southern kingdoms, a deliberate choice to identify herself as foreign. In Kush, we pride ourselves on recognizing quality. Something flickered in Nefara's eyes, a flash of recognition quickly suppressed. You're far from home, she observed, continuing the conversation in the same southern tongue with surprising fluency. As are you in your way, Ankerson replied, meeting Nefara's gaze directly. Not all palaces are built of stone, are they? Some we construct in our minds, from memories we can't let go. The blood drained from Nefara's face, though she maintained her composure admirably. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Ankerson selected a small piece of cloth, pretending to examine it closely. It's a curious thing. I've traveled weeks to meet my intended husband, only to discover his heart may be otherwise engaged. Nefara's hands stilled on the fabric she'd been folding. You're Princess Ankerson of Kush, she confirmed with a slight nod. Though today, I'm simply a woman with questions about the man I'm meant to marry. To her credit, Nefara didn't flinch or cower. She simply set down her work and met the princess's gaze steadily. Then you should direct those questions to him, not to me. I've tried. He speaks the necessary words, performs the required rituals, but his mind wanders elsewhere. Ankerson stepped closer, lowering her voice. Perhaps to a small house in the Weavers' district he visited last night. Nefara's eyes widened slightly before she mastered her expression. Whatever you may have heard, I don't deal in gossip, Ankerson interrupted. I deal in facts, and the fact is, Pharaoh Ramses visited your home after midnight. Not the action of a man focused on his upcoming marriage and the alliance it represents. For a long moment, the two women regarded each other in tense silence. Around them, the marketplace continued its bustling commerce, oblivious to the quiet confrontation between princess and weaver. I have no claim on him, Nefara finally said, her voice soft but firm. What existed between us was childish friendship, nothing more. It belongs to the past. Yet he comes to you in the night risking scandal, Ankerson observed. That suggests the past is very much alive. Nefara turned away, busying herself with rearranging bolts of cloth that needed no adjustment. He came seeking answers about old wounds, nothing more. And did he find them? I sent him away, Nefara replied, a hint of pain threading through her carefully controlled voice. As I should have done immediately. It was inappropriate for him to come. Ankerson studied the other woman thoughtfully. There was more here than she had initially suspected. Not just a childhood affection that had lingered, but something deeper, more complex, a tangle of old pain, betrayal, and perhaps loyalty that still bound these two together, despite the years and differences in station that now separated them. Walk with me, she said abruptly, making it clear this was a command, not a request. After a moment's hesitation, Nefara nodded to the workshop overseer and fell into step beside the princess. They made an incongruous pair, the disguised princess in her simple handmaid's dress and the weaver in her workday clothes. Yet there was a similar grace to both women's movements, a shared, quiet dignity. They walked in silence until they reached a small garden shrine to Hathor, relatively deserted at this hour. Only an elderly priest dozed in the corner, paying them no mind. I didn't come to Thebes on a whim, Ankerson said without preamble. This marriage has been negotiated for years. It joins two great kingdoms, secures our mutual borders, establishes trade routes that will bring prosperity to both our peoples. Her gaze was direct, unflinching. I will not allow a childhood sentiment to jeopardize what thousands of people have worked for. Nor would I, Nephara replied with equal directness, which is why I told him our paths cannot cross again. And yet they have repeatedly, since his chance sighting of you in the marketplace. Ankerson paced the small garden, the strategist in her calculating possibilities. Men like Ramses, they fixate on what they cannot have. The forbidden fruit is always sweetest. Nephara's expression hardened. I am not a fruit to be plucked, princess, nor a problem for you to solve. I have told Ramses that his duty lies with you and the alliance you represent. What more would you have of me? Leave Thebes, Ankerson said bluntly. Return to the outer provinces, or better yet, cross the border to another kingdom entirely. Nephara stared at her in disbelief, then let out a short, bitter laugh. Just like that? Abandon the life I've built here over 10 years of struggle? The customers who depend on me, the apprentices I train? I would compensate you, of course, Ankerson replied, reaching beneath her simple dress to withdraw a small pouch that clinked heavily with the unmistakable sound of gold. Enough to establish yourself comfortably elsewhere, to start anew, free from painful memories. For a moment, something dangerous flashed in Nephara's eyes, a glimpse of the fierce spirit that had once made her the equal playmate of a future pharaoh. Then her expression closed like a door being shut. Keep your gold, princess, she said quietly. I may be a common weaver now, but I still have my dignity. Dignity won't protect you from a royal command, Ankerson countered, though she tucked the gold away. If I ask Ramses to banish you, for the good of the kingdom, for the success of our alliance, do you think he would refuse? The color drained from Nephara's face, but her voice remained steady. Then do so if you must. But know that such an action would reveal more about your insecurity than my influence. The two women faced each other like duelists, neither willing to yield ground. In another life, Ankerson thought fleetingly, they might have been allies, perhaps even friends. Both strong-willed, both intelligent, both fiercely independent in their different ways. I don't wish to be your enemy, Nephara, she said finally, softening her tone, but I will be Queen of Egypt, and I will not share my husband's heart, not with a memory, not with a ghost from his past, and certainly not with a living, breathing woman in the same city. You speak as if I seek his attention, Nephara replied, a hint of frustration breaking through her careful control. I do not. I have rejected his offers of help, of restoration to court. I want nothing from him, except perhaps justice for your father, Ankerson suggested shrewdly. Rehabilitation of your family name? Nephara's silence was answer enough. Consider my proposal, Ankerson continued, her voice gentler now, almost sympathetic. Not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Her fresh start, far from painful memories, with means to live comfortably. Is that not preferable to remaining here, always looking over your shoulder, wondering when the past might again collide with the present? Before Nephara could respond, a commotion arose from the marketplace, the unmistakable sound of royal guards approaching, the crowd parting before them. It seems our time for private conversation has ended, Ankerson observed, quickly readjusting her headscarf to better conceal her features. Consider what I've said, Nephara, for all our sakes. With that, she slipped away down a side path, vanishing among the date palms just as a contingent of palace guards entered the small garden, led by a harried-looking Nehesi who had abandoned his disguise for his formal Kushite uniform. Princess, he called, relief evident in his voice as he spotted her, you must return to the palace immediately. The pharaoh has called for a special ceremony at midday, one that concerns you directly. Ankerson's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded, allowing herself to be escorted back toward the palace. As they departed, she cast one last glance over her shoulder, meeting Nephara's watchful gaze across the garden. A silent message passed between the two women, an acknowledgement that their battle for Ramses' future had only just begun, and that neither would yield easily what they believed was rightfully theirs, a kingdom for one, redemption for the other. What neither yet realized was that the gods of Egypt had their own plans that would soon throw all their carefully laid strategies into chaos. The temple of Amun hummed with anticipation as the greatest festival of the year, the celebration of Opet, reached its zenith. Hundreds of oil lamps cast a golden glow over the massive stone columns, while incense smoke curled toward the star-speckled night sky, visible through the temple's open courtyards. The elite of Thebes gathered in their finest linen, adorned with gold and precious stones that caught the light with every movement. At the center of it all stood Ramses, resplendent in his ceremonial regalia, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt resting upon his head, his broad pectoral collar inlaid with lapis, carnelian and turquoise, the golden crook and flail of kingship clutched in his hands. Beside him, Princess Ankhesen glittered like a dark jewel in gold-embroidered crimson linen, her elegant neck encircled with a collar of Kushite amber, strands of gold beads woven through her intricate braids. They made a striking pair, the golden pharaoh and his ebony princess, as they performed the ritual dance that symbolized the union of their two kingdoms. To the onlookers, crowded in the temple courtyards and clustered on the steps beyond, it was a magnificent spectacle, the culmination of days of feasting and celebration. Only those closest to the royal couple might notice the careful distance maintained between them, despite the intimacy of the dance, or the way Ramses' eyes occasionally drifted toward the temple entrance, as if searching for someone among the sea of faces. "Your thoughts are elsewhere again, Pharaoh," Ankhesen murmured as they circled each other in the intricate steps of the ritual dance. "One might think you find my company lacking." Ramses forced his attention back to the princess, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Forgive me. The weight of ceremony sometimes distracts me." "Does it?" Ankhesen replied, her own smile perfectly maintained for the benefit of watching nobles. "Or perhaps it's the weight of memory. I understand she received an invitation to tonight's celebration, a most unusual honor for a common weaver." Ramses missed a step in the dance, quickly recovering before anyone could notice. "You've been making inquiries," he said, keeping his voice low despite the surge of anger he felt. "Know your allies and your enemies, the first lesson of rulership," Ankhesen replied smoothly. "Isn't that what your father's advisor taught you? What Senenmut would have taught you had he remained at court?" The mention of Nefer's father nearly caused Ramses to falter again, but years of training in royal composure saved him. As the ritual dance concluded, he and Ankhesen bowed to each other, then to the monumental statue of Amun-Ra that dominated the inner sanctuary. The high priest stepped forward, raising his arms to signal the transition to the next phase of the celebration. "The divine pharaoh and his chosen bride have honored the gods with the sacred dance," the priest intoned, his voice carrying through the vast chamber. "Now let all of Kemet rejoice. Let music fill the air, let wine flow like the blessed Nile." At his words, musicians stationed around the temple began to play, drums pounding out heart-quickening rhythms, harps and flutes weaving complex melodies that seemed to dance on the incense-laden air. Servants moved through the crowd with trays of wine cups and platters of delicacies. The formal ceremony complete, the celebration transformed into something more relaxed, though no less magnificent. Ramses accepted a cup of wine from a passing servant, using the moment to scan the crowd once more. Had she come? He had sent the invitation on an impulse, knowing it would cause whispers among the court. A common weaver invited to the most exclusive religious festival of the year, unheard of, yet he had done it anyway, desperate for another glimpse of her after their last painful encounter. "Your Majesty," a silky voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find General Horemheb bowing before him, the very man who, according to Pentu, had engineered Senenmut's disgrace. Ramses felt his hand tighten around his wine cup. "General," he acknowledged coolly, "you're looking well." "As are you, Divine One." The general straightened, his aging but still powerful frame draped in military finery, medals and honors from countless campaigns glinting on his chest. "The gods have blessed us with a magnificent celebration, and an even more magnificent future queen." He inclined his head toward Ankhesen, who was engaged in conversation with several Kushite nobles nearby. "Indeed," Ramses replied, struggling to maintain the pleasantries with the man he now suspected of destroying Nefer's family. "The princess brings great honor to our court, and great wealth," Horemheb added with a thin smile. "Her dowry will fund our military campaigns for years to come. The Hittites grow bolder at our northern borders. With Kushite gold and warriors at our back, we can finally crush them once and for all." Ramses nodded absently, his attention caught by a flutter of movement near the temple entrance. A newcomer had arrived, a woman in a simple but elegant blue gown, her dark hair partially covered by a modest veil. Even at this distance, he would know that graceful bearing anywhere. Nefer. She had come. "If you'll excuse me, General," Ramses murmured, already moving away, oblivious to the calculating look that crossed Horemheb's face as he tracked the direction of the pharaoh's gaze. Ramses made his way through the crowd, which parted instinctively before him, despite the relaxed atmosphere of the celebration. He was halfway across the vast court when Ankhesen suddenly appeared at his side, slipping her arm through his with practiced grace. "The Kushite ambassador wishes to present his gift," she said smoothly, steering him toward a group of her countrymen, a ceremonial shield believed to have belonged to the first king of Kush over 500 years ago. Ramses allowed himself to be guided, though his eyes remained fixed on Nephara, who now stood near one of the massive columns, looking both regal and uncomfortable, as curious nobles glanced her way. She wore no jewelry save for a single band of copper at her wrist, humble compared to the ostentatious wealth on display around her, yet somehow more striking for its simplicity. "The shield can wait," Ramses said, gently but firmly disengaging his arm from Ankhesen's. "There is someone I must greet." The princess's eyes flashed with momentary anger before her diplomatic mask slid back into place. "Of course, Divine One. But remember, all of Thebes watches you tonight. Every gesture, every word carries the weight of divine precedent." It was a warning, delicately phrased but unmistakable. Ramses met her gaze directly. "I am well aware of who I am, Princess, and of what is expected of me." With that, he continued toward Nephara, conscious of the ripple of whispers that followed in his wake. By the time he reached her, a small space had cleared around her column, as if the other guests were simultaneously drawn to and repelled by this commoner in their midst. "Ah, you came," Ramses said simply, stopping before her. Nephara bowed low, the proper obeisance of a subject to her pharaoh. "How could I refuse a royal command?" she replied, her voice carefully neutral as she straightened. "It wasn't a command. It was an invitation," Ramses corrected softly. "One I wasn't certain you would accept." "Nor was I," she admitted, glancing around at the opulent surroundings. "I don't belong here, Ramses. These people look at me as if I'm a curiosity from a foreign land." "You belong wherever I say you belong," he replied, then winced at how imperious it sounded. I know what you meant," Nephara interrupted, a ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time since their reunion. "You always did struggle with the difference between what you wanted to say and what a prince should say." The familiar teasing, a fleeting echo of their childhood rapport, caught Ramses off guard. He felt a smile spread across his face, unbidden and genuine in a way his expressions rarely were these days. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, as the musicians struck up a new melody, a traditional tune celebrating the fertility brought by the Nile's annual flooding. Nephara's eyes widened in alarm. "What? No, that would be entirely inappropriate. The scandal alone would—" "Since when did you care about propriety?" Ramses challenged, extending his hand. "The Nephara I remember climbed the sacred sycamore tree in the temple garden just to see if the birds' eggs had hatched." "That was a lifetime ago," she protested, though the memory brought a warmth to her eyes. "We were children then, with children's freedom." "And now I am Pharaoh," Ramses countered, his hand still outstretched, "divine ruler of all Kemet. If I wished to dance with an old friend during the most joyous festival of the year, who would dare object?" The answer, of course, was everyone. The high priest, the nobles, Princess Ankhesen and her entourage, General Horemheb and his military faction, all would see such an act as shocking at best, sacrilegious at worst. And Nephara knew it too, judging by the conflict that played across her expressive face. "Ramses, please," she said quietly, "don't do this. Not for me. The alliance with Kush is too important to risk over a dance. Perhaps I'm tired of every movement, every breath being calculated for political advantage," Ramses replied, suddenly fierce. "Perhaps, just once, I wish to act according to my own heart rather than the dictates of tradition." Something shifted in Nephara's expression, a softening, a yielding. "Your heart," she repeated softly. "And what does it tell you, Pharaoh of Kemet?" The look that passed between them was electric, charged with years of unspoken emotions, of paths not taken, of possibilities denied by circumstance and station. Around them, the celebration continued, but for that moment they might have been alone in the vast temple. "It tells me," Ramses said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear, "that I have missed you every day since you disappeared from my life, and that I would trade all the gold in Kush for a single honest conversation where you don't hide behind walls of formality and past hurt." Nephara's composure wavered, genuine emotion breaking through her careful facade. "Ramses, Before she could finish, the music changed. the tempo quickening as drums took prominence in the melody. It was the signal for the traditional dance of life, a celebration of fertility and renewal associated with the goddess Hathor. Ramses made his decision in an instant, propriety and caution abandoned like a cloak shed in desert heat. He reached out, taking Nefertari's hand firmly in his own. "Dance with me," he said again, no longer a request, but not quite a command. Something in between, something personal and urgent. "Just one dance, Nefertari, for the sake of who we once were to each other." Perhaps it was the music, pulsing like a heartbeat through the stone floors of the ancient temple. Perhaps it was the wine she had sipped upon arrival, loosening the tight control she maintained over her emotions. Or perhaps it was simply the look in Ramses' eyes, earnest, vulnerable in a way the Pharaoh of Egypt could never afford to be in public. Whatever the reason, Nefertari nodded once slowly and allowed him to lead her toward the center of the court where other nobles had already begun to dance. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly as the Pharaoh and the common weaver took their places among the dancers. Ramses was acutely aware of Pentu's horrified expression, of General Horemheb's calculating gaze, of Princess Ankhesen's barely concealed fury, but in that moment, he couldn't bring himself to care. The dance began simply, two lines of participants facing each other, stepping forward and back in rhythm with the drums. But as the music intensified, so did the movements, becoming more expressive, more intimate. Partners circled each other, palms touching, bodies swaying in ancient patterns that celebrated the eternal cycle of life along the Nile. Nefertari moved with natural grace, her initial reluctance melting away as muscle memory took over. She had been taught these same court dances as a child, had practiced them alongside Ramses under the watchful eye of the royal dance master. Now, despite the years of separation, they found their rhythm together effortlessly, as if no time had passed at all. "You remember," Ramses said with delight as they circled each other, palms pressed together, her blue gown swirling around her ankles. "My body remembers," Nefertari admitted, a genuine smile illuminating her features for the first time. "Though I haven't danced like this since the celebration of my 16th birthday," Ramses finished for her. "You wore yellow then, the color of the sun." The fact that he remembered such a detail after all these years visibly affected her. A blush darkened her cheeks, and for a moment, the careful walls she had built around her heart seemed to crumble. As the dance grew more elaborate, the other participants began to falter, steps forgotten in their distraction over the unprecedented spectacle before them. One by one, couples moved to the edges of the floor until only Ramses and Nefertari remained, dancing as if possessed by the spirit of Hathor herself. They moved together in perfect synchronicity, his golden splendor complementing her quiet elegance. For those few transcendent minutes, it didn't matter that one was divine pharaoh and the other a common weaver. They were simply Ramses and Nefertari, two souls connected by bonds that transcended time and circumstance. The music reached its crescendo, and with it the dance called for the closest contact yet, the man's hands at the woman's waist, lifting her briefly as she arched backward, symbolizing the life-giving waters of the Nile, embracing the fertile land of Egypt. Without hesitation, Ramses grasped Nefertari's waist, feeling the warmth of her body through the thin linen of her gown as he lifted her. Their eyes locked, and in that suspended moment everything else fell away, the temple, the shocked onlookers, the weight of tradition and duty. There was only this connection, this perfect understanding between them. When he set her down again, they remained closer than protocol would ever permit, their faces inches apart, breathing the same air. Something passed between them, unspoken but profound, a recognition of feelings buried but never truly forgotten. Then the music ended, the sudden silence jarring them back to reality. No one moved, no one spoke. The entire assembly seemed frozen in collective shock at what they had just witnessed. The pharaoh, living embodiment of Horus on earth, promised to a foreign princess dancing with intimate familiarity with a disgraced commoner. It was unprecedented, scandalous, perhaps even sacrilegious. The spell was broken by the high priest, who stepped forward with a forced smile that did nothing to hide his dismay. "The pharaoh honors us with a demonstration of the ancient dance. Truly, the gods speak through his divine movements." It was a desperate attempt to frame what had just happened as some kind of planned religious performance, rather than the impulsive, emotionally charged moment it had actually been. But the damage was done. Around the temple court, nobles whispered behind their hands. Kushite delegates conferred with worried expressions. and Princess Ankhesen stood perfectly still, her face a mask of diplomatic composure, belied only by the dangerous glitter in her eyes. Ramses, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what he had done, released Nephara's hands and took a step back, but he didn't apologize or look away. Instead, he placed his hand briefly over his heart, a small personal gesture meant only for her. "Thank you," he said simply, loudly enough for others to hear. "You honor the festival with your grace." Nephara, her own composure recovered, bowed deeply. "The honor was mine, Divine One," she replied formally, though her voice trembled slightly. Without waiting for dismissal, she backed away, then turned and moved swiftly toward the temple exit. As she disappeared into the night, Ramses felt a presence at his side. Princess Ankhesen had joined him, her arm once again linking with his in a gesture that to observers would appear affectionate, but which Ramses could feel was rigid with controlled anger. "An interesting choice of dance partner, Divine One," she murmured, her smile never faltering though her fingers dug into his arm like talons. "I wonder what the court will make of it." "I care not for gossip," Ramses replied, though he knew his actions would have consequences far beyond mere talk. "Perhaps you should," Ankhesen countered, "for gossip can become sedition, and sedition rebellion, when a ruler is perceived to act against tradition and propriety." She paused, then added more softly, "But of course, you already know this. It's what happened to her father, isn't it? Whispers that became accusations that became disgrace." The implied threat wasn't lost on Ramses. He turned to face his intended bride fully, meeting her calculating gaze with one equally resolute. "Be very careful, Princess," he said quietly. "You are not yet queen, and I am not a man easily threatened or manipulated." Ankhesen's smile never wavered. "Nor am I a woman who shares what is rightfully hers," she replied. "Remember that, Pharaoh, before you dance again with ghosts from your past." With that, she released his arm and glided away to charm a group of Egyptian nobles, leaving Ramses alone in the center of the court, surrounded by hundreds yet utterly isolated in his power and his growing uncertainty. Outside the temple, Nephara pressed herself against a stone column, her heart racing, her body still humming with the memory of the dance. She closed her eyes, fighting against the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed defenses. "Foolish," she whispered to herself, though whether she meant Ramses for initiating the dance or herself for accepting, she couldn't say. So foolish. But as she slipped away into the night, the blue gown swirling around her ankles, she couldn't deny the truth that the dance had forced her to confront. Whatever had existed between them as children had not died or faded with time. It had merely been buried, like a seed in desert soil, waiting for the merest drop of rain to spark it back to life. And tonight, that seed had not only germinated, it had burst into full, dangerous bloom. The palace corridors lay silent in the deepest hours of night. Through these shadows, Princess Ankhesen moved like a desert spirit, her footsteps soundless on polished stone. After the scandal of the temple dance, she had waited for this perfect moment to act. At a seldom-used side entrance, Nehesi confirmed her trap was set. The message was delivered as instructed. "She believes it's from the pharaoh himself. Wait at the outer gate. Ensure we are not disturbed." Within minutes, Nephara appeared, wearing a simple hooded cloak. Confusion crossed her face as she found the corridor empty. "He's not coming," Ankhesen said, stepping from the shadows. Nephara whirled. "You forged the pharaoh's seal. A necessary deception," Ankhesen acknowledged without remorse. "I doubted you would come if summoned by me directly." "I have no interest in whatever game you're playing, Princess." Nephara turned to leave. "It's no game," Ankhesen replied, her voice hardening. "It's the future of two kingdoms, the lives of thousands, all of which you place at risk with every glance, every word, every dance. I didn't seek him out. I didn't ask to dance. Yet you accepted. You chose to publicly humiliate your future queen. That was never my intention," Nephara protested, genuine distress crossing her features. Ankhesen produced a wooden box inlaid with ivory. Inside lay a heavy gold collar set with rubies, a fortune that could support a family for generations. "Leave Thebes," she said simply. "Tonight. Take this and go far from Egypt. Build a new life, free from painful memories and impossible dreams." Nephara stared at the jewelry. "You think you can buy me off? I'm offering you freedom. From poverty, from disgrace, from the pain of watching Ramses rule with me at his side." "What I want doesn't matter," Nephara said quietly. "The gods wrote our destinies long before we were born. Yours to rule, mine to serve. Then accept your destiny with grace, Ankerson urged. Take my offer. Free him from the confusion your presence causes. And if I refuse? Ankerson stepped closer. Did you know there's still a price on your father's head? A bounty for any co-conspirators in his alleged treason, never collected, because he supposedly acted alone. Fear flickered in Nefara's eyes. You wouldn't dare. I do what I must for Kush, for Egypt, for the alliance that will strengthen both our kingdoms. Nefara studied the princess with new understanding. In another life, I think we might have been allies. We're not so different, both strong-willed, both devoted to those we love. It doesn't have to be this way, Ankerson said, returning to the open jewel box. For a moment, temptation crossed Nefara's face, not for the wealth, but for the escape it represented. Then her expression hardened as she gently closed the lid. I built my life here piece by piece after losing everything, she said softly. I won't be chased away by threats or bribed into disappearing. Not again. I won't pursue him, she added. I've told him our paths cannot cross again, and I meant it. The dance was a moment of weakness. Pretty words, Ankerson replied skeptically, but I've seen how you look at each other. Some fires cannot be extinguished by mere promises. Then perhaps you should focus less on eliminating me and more on winning his heart, Nefara said with quiet dignity before disappearing into the darkness. Later that night, Ankerson sought out General Horemheb, the man who had engineered Senenmut's disgrace years ago. The Weaver woman presents a complication to our alliance, she told him directly. Indeed, Horemheb agreed. The pharaoh's display at the temple was most irregular. That record still contains an outstanding bounty for accomplices in Senenmut's conspiracy, Ankerson observed carefully. Understanding dawned in the general's eyes. A legal mechanism that could be reactivated if necessary. Precisely. Allies concerned with Egypt's stability will always support actions that preserve that stability, Horemheb assured her, even when such actions might temporarily displease the divine pharaoh himself. As dawn broke, Nefara made her decision. She would neither flee nor fight. She would disappear from Ramses' life while remaining in plain sight. A living ghost he would see, but never speak to again. It was the only way, for both their sakes. Little did she know that the gods had set in motion events that would make such a resolution impossible. 3 days after the scandalous dance, Ramses performed the ritual blessing of the sacred Plaza, where his wedding celebration would soon take place. Common folk gathered at the edges, hoping for a glimpse of their living god as he consecrated the grounds. As he raised the golden ankh, symbol of eternal life, to complete the ceremony, his eyes found Nefara at the plaza's edge, partially hidden behind a column. She hadn't meant to be seen, and when their eyes met, she subtly shook her head, silently pleading with him to look away. But something beyond reason took control of Ramses. Still holding the sacred ankh, he stepped away from the altar and walked directly toward her, ignoring the confused murmurs and Penthu's dismayed exclamation behind him. The crowd parted before him. Nefara bowed deeply, avoiding his gaze. Rise, Ramses commanded. She obeyed but kept her eyes downcast. Divine One, you honor your humble servant with your attention. Look at me, he said softly. Please, she whispered. Not here. They're watching. Let them watch. The gallery had grown silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on this unexpected drama. Princess Ankerson stood motionless in the distance, her face a mask concealing fury. When Nefara finally raised her eyes, they held a complex mixture of emotions: fear, longing, regret, and something deeper that had survived years of separation. Whatever exists between us cannot be acknowledged here, she pleaded. You risk too much, and if I'm willing to risk it, then you are not the wise king your father raised you to be, she answered honestly, and I cannot bear to be the cause of your downfall. Her words awoke something defiant in Ramses' heart. Perhaps a true king must sometimes defy tradition to find a deeper truth. Without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss lasted mere seconds, but its impact was seismic. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by shocked silence. In Egypt's long history, no pharaoh had ever displayed such intimate affection in public, certainly not with a commoner, and never during a sacred ceremony. When he pulled away, Nefara stared at him with horror. What have you done? She breathed. Reality crashed back. The high priest tore at his robes in distress. Princess Ankerson's cold rage was visible even from a distance, while General Horemheb watched with calculating interest. Your Majesty, Pentu reached his side, face ashen. We must complete the ceremony. The gods know what is in my heart, Ramses interrupted. And it is not ritual they desire, but truth. Nephara began trembling, understanding the danger better than Ramses himself. She fell to her knees. Divine One, forgive your servant for inspiring such unusual devotion. The fault is mine alone. She was offering herself as scapegoat, Ramses realized, a sacrifice that could lead to her execution. No, he said firmly, raising her to her feet. There is no fault here, only truth too long denied. This woman's father suffered false accusations. Today I honor her loyalty and suffering with the pharaoh's blessing. Pentu stepped forward, desperate to salvage the situation. The pharaoh demonstrates the compassion of the gods themselves. Truly, divine justice flows through his actions. But the damage was done. In one impulsive moment, Ramses had challenged not just protocol and hierarchy, but the religious foundations of his rule. Complete the ceremony, he instructed Pentu. I will return to the palace. As guards moved to escort him, Ramses reluctantly released Nephara's hand. Be careful, he whispered. Send word if you need protection. And who will protect you, Ramses? She replied softly. You have awakened forces you may not be able to control. As he walked away, Princess Ankhesen watched his retreat with cold calculation, already conferring with General Horemheb. Whatever trust had been building between her and Ramses lay shattered now. And in the center of the plaza, Nephara stood alone, the lingering warmth of the pharaoh's kiss on her lips, aware that her life had just been irrevocably altered once again by forces beyond her control. The kiss of defiance had been planted like a seed in fertile soil. What would grow from it remained to be seen, but grow it would for better or worse, changing the landscape of Kemet forever. In the sacred chamber of Maat, Ramses faced the kingdom's most powerful men. The high priest of Amun, aged Pentu, the royal treasurer, General Horemheb, and his father, the former pharaoh, summoned from retirement after yesterday's scandal. The situation is unprecedented, the high priest said. The temple oracles report mixed omens. Mixed? General Horemheb snorted. The Kushite delegation threatens to withdraw completely. Their ships could sail by tomorrow. Enough, Ramses interrupted. I acted because a grave injustice was committed under my father's reign, an injustice I intend to correct. All eyes turned to the former pharaoh. You speak of Senenmut, the older man stated flatly. The loyal servant falsely accused of treason, Ramses corrected. His daughter reduced to poverty when she should have been raised in the palace. Divine One, with respect, the evidence against Senenmut was substantial, General Horemheb said. Letters in his own hand, forgeries, Ramses cut in, created by those who coveted his position. The high priest shifted uncomfortably. Even if true, your public display has caused confusion. Some whisper that the gods have withdrawn their favor. What concerns me is the Kushite reaction, Horemheb added. Princess Ankhesen feels publicly humiliated. Ramses faced the assembly directly. Therefore, I decree, Senenmut's name is to be restored to honor. His daughter compensated for undeserved hardship, and the marriage negotiations with Kush will be temporarily suspended. The chamber erupted in protests until the former pharaoh spoke. My son, a pharaoh's heart cannot belong solely to himself. It must encompass all of Kemet. I am still a man, Ramses replied wearily, a man who has witnessed injustice and cannot turn away, even for reasons of state. And what of the Weaver woman? General Horemheb asked softly. Is it justice that drives your actions or something more interpersonal? My feelings for Nephara are irrelevant to her father's innocence, Ramses replied, but I will not hide the truth. Yes, I care for her. Had circumstances been different, she might have become my queen. After dismissing the council, father and son faced each other alone. You disappoint me, the former pharaoh said, not because you seek justice, but because you allow personal feelings to cloud your judgment. And you disappointed me when you allowed an innocent man to be condemned on false evidence. His father's shoulders sagged. I chose exile over execution. It was the mercy I could grant without appearing weak. And now you face a similar choice, he continued. Justice for one family against the welfare of the entire kingdom. The alliance with Kush secures our southern border for a generation. What would you have me do? Ramses asked finally. Compromise. Restore the girl's status without directly accusing Horemheb. Proceed with the Kushite marriage. And Nephara? He asked quietly. His father's eyes softened. History is filled with pharaohs who married for duty, but found comfort elsewhere. Discretion, not denial, is the way of kings. The suggestion that Ramses might marry Ankhesen while keeping Nephara as mistress left a bitter taste in his mouth. Neither woman deserved such an arrangement. "I need time," Ramses said finally. "Time to find a path that serves both justice and the kingdom's needs." Outside, General Horemheb's spy detached from the shadows, while across Thebes, Nephara sat beside her idle loom, palace guards stationed at her door. She touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss. "Oh, Ramses," she whispered, "what have we done?" Dawn broke over Thebes as Nephara gathered only what she could carry in a single bag: a change of clothes, her father's wooden amulet, her meager savings, and the lapis lazuli scarab Ramses had returned to her by messenger, wrapped with a note: "Keep this safe until we meet again." The palace guards posted outside her door had been watching for 3 days since Ramses's impulsive kiss. 3 days of rumors spreading through every level of society, of growing tension as the Kushite delegation prepared to depart. Nobles gathered in factions, and the army stood alert for unrest. "It ends today," she whispered, securing her sandals. With the grace developed in childhood escapades with Ramses, she slipped through her rear window, evading the inattentive guards. Moving through back streets to avoid detection, she reached the modest shrine of Bastet, near the city's northern gate, where the elderly priestess Meketra, once a friend of her mother, greeted her without surprise. "All of Thebes has heard," the priestess said. "The pharaoh's kiss is on everyone's lips." "I need to leave the city," Nephara explained. "Ramses stands against his own court because of me. The alliance with Kush hangs by a thread. There are whispers of military factions forming." "Perhaps he believes you are worth the risk," Meketra suggested. "No one is worth the stability of the kingdom," Nephara replied firmly. "His duty to Egypt is carved into his soul, yet for the sake of old memories, he risks everything." "Do you truly believe he will simply accept your disappearance and meekly marry his Kushite princess?" the priestess asked skeptically. "Without me here to focus his rebellion, his sense of duty will reassert itself," Nephara said with more confidence than she felt. "It's not love, it's guilt, misplaced loyalty to my father's memory." Meketra merely shook her head. "What would you have of me?" "Safe passage out of Thebes," Nephara replied, withdrawing the scarab amulet. "Will you see that this reaches the pharaoh after I've gone? It was his once. It should return to him." "You would leave him nothing else? No word of explanation?" "Words would only give him something to argue against. The amulet will speak what needs to be said." The priestess arranged passage on a temple barge leaving at midday. Hours later, as it slipped away from its mooring, Nephara stood watching Thebes recede into the distance. "Forgive me," she whispered to the wind. "Some prices are too high to pay, even for a pharaoh." She clutched her father's wooden amulet, having left everything else behind: her home, her loom, her reputation, and her heart, which she knew would remain forever in Thebes. As the current carried the barge around a bend in the river, Thebes disappeared from view. Nephara turned her gaze forward, toward an uncertain future but one she had chosen freely, a sacrifice made out of love rather than imposed by power. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, a guard captain knelt before Ramses. "The weaver woman is gone, Divine One. Her home stands empty." Ramses stared at the messenger, his knuckles whitening around the arms of his throne. "Search the city, every district, every home if necessary. Find her. Divine One, the general suggests she may have fled Thebes entirely. Find her," Ramses repeated, each word heavy with authority. "I will not believe she has abandoned her home without cause." As the guard hurried away, Ramses felt cold dread settling in his chest. If Nephara had truly fled, it was not from fear for herself but to protect him. "Oh, Nephara," he thought, "what have you done?" What neither knew was that their separation would prove merely the first move in a game where General Horemheb and Princess Ankhesen were already positioning their pieces for the next decisive play. A month had passed since Nephara's disappearance, and the royal palace had become a place of shadows and whispers. Despite extensive searches and growing rewards, no trace of her had been found. Only the elderly priestess of Bastet admitted that Nephara had sought sanctuary briefly at her shrine, delivering the lapis lazuli scarab that now rarely left Ramses' hand. The pharaoh moved through his duties mechanically, his mind constantly elsewhere. Court sessions were cut short, decisions delayed, and the usual vibrancy of palace life had withered into tense silence. "It worsens by the day," Pentu murmured to the high priest. How long before the people notice their living God's spirit has abandoned his duties? They already whisper, the high priest replied grimly. In the markets, in the temples, they say the gods have withdrawn their favor. In the private gardens where he and Nephara had once played as children, Ramses paced restlessly. Why, Nephara? Why leave without a word? My son, his father said, appearing at the garden entrance. I've come not to lecture, but with concern. A pharaoh must be more than a figurehead performing prescribed rituals. He must be the living embodiment of divine order. And if that heart is wounded, Ramses asked quietly, what then? Then he must heal it, for the sake of all who depend upon him, his father answered. Egypt cannot afford a ruler whose thoughts drift constantly to a woman who chose to leave. Their conversation was interrupted by a guard announcing Princess Ankhesen's request for an immediate audience, mentioning she had information about the weaver woman. In the small reception chamber, Ankhesen had abandoned her foreign regalia for simple Egyptian attire. I have received intelligence that she was seen boarding a temple barge to Edfu, she revealed. Ramses was immediately on his feet, mind racing with plans to send search parties, when Ankhesen's question stopped him. To what end? What happens if you find her? The same problems remain. Nothing is resolved by her presence, as she herself clearly understood when she chose to leave. The truth struck Ramses forcefully. What could he offer Nephara? A life as his mistress? The constant scrutiny of a court that would never accept her? I have spent a month watching a great ruler diminish himself for love of a woman who is no longer here. Ankhesen continued with unexpected gentleness. Make a decision, Divine One. Not half a decision, but a clear choice. If you truly love this woman enough to risk your kingdom's stability, then pursue her with all your heart. But if duty ultimately outweighs desire, then honor her sacrifice and commit fully to your role as pharaoh. Before Ramses could respond, Penthu burst in. Divine One, your father has collapsed in the garden. He asks for you urgently. Ramses found his father beneath the sycamore tree, his breathing shallow. The kingdom stands at a precipice, the old man whispered. Your distraction, my weakness, Horemheb's ambition, all converge. A divided heart makes a divided kingdom. Choose your path and walk it wholly. As his father slipped into unconsciousness, Ramses tucked the scarab amulet deep into his robes. His duty now was clear. He must be fully present as pharaoh. Penthu, he called with new resolve, summon the royal council immediately. While my father fights for his life, I will ensure his legacy remains secure. Far to the south, Nephara sat alone by the Nile. Be strong, she whispered northward. Be the pharaoh you were born to be. Neither knew that the gods had set events in motion that would soon bring them face to face once more. Under circumstances neither could have imagined. 3 years had passed since Nephara fled Thebes. In the small village of Esna, she had built a new life as a respected weaver with several apprentices. News from the capital reached her sporadically. The former pharaoh had died. Ramses had emerged from mourning more focused and decisive. The Kushite alliance had been secured through treaties rather than marriage. Princess Ankhesen had returned home as her father's designated heir. What the scattered reports didn't mention was whether Ramses had married. The question haunted her quiet evenings alone. When a royal barge arrived at Esna's docks, Nephara tried to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her chest. That evening, a firm knock at her door revealed a royal guard and a court official who proved to be Meritaten, once captain of Ramses' personal guard. After all this time, Meritaten murmured, the descriptions hardly do you justice. Once inside, she placed a familiar object on the table, the lapis lazuli scarab amulet Nephara had given Ramses as a child. It never leaves his private chambers, Meritaten explained. I've come because Egypt stands at a crossroads, and the path forward may depend on you. The pharaoh is dying. Dying? Nephara gasped. An assassin's poison, slow-acting. The priests give him perhaps a month. Meritaten's voice tightened with fury. General Horemheb's faction, we believe, positioning themselves for the succession crisis. Succession crisis? But surely Ramses has an heir. Meritaten shook her head. The pharaoh never married, despite immense pressure. He claimed no suitable match could be found, but there were whispers his heart had been given long ago to a woman who vanished. Tears blurred Nephara's vision. She had left to free him from an impossible choice, yet her absence had created a different impediment. He asks for you, Meritaten said simply. In his lucid moments between pain and fever, he speaks your name. Begs the gods to let him see you once more before he journeys to the field of reeds. When would we leave? Nephara asked quietly. 4 days later, she entered the pharaoh's dimly lit bedchamber. Ramses lay thin and pallid, his once powerful frame ravaged by poison, yet when his eyes found her, they lit with joy that transcended his physical deterioration. "Nephara," he whispered, "you came." She took his hand, thinner than she remembered, the skin papery and cool. "Did you think I wouldn't? I never wanted to be lost to you," she admitted, as they spoke through the afternoon and evening. "I only wanted you to become the pharaoh Egypt needed." "And I tried," he replied. "I did everything a great pharaoh should, except one. I could not give to another what already belonged to you, not my heart, not my name, not my future." As night deepened and his strength ebbed, Ramses made an unexpected request. "Stay, not just until the end comes, but after. Egypt faces a succession crisis. As the pharaoh's wife, your words would carry weight in the transitional council." "Your wife?" she repeated, shocked. "The high priest can perform the ceremony tonight. It's not the lifetime together we might have had, but it would give you legal standing to influence what comes after." "You've planned this," Nephara realized. "I arranged for you to be found because I couldn't bear to leave without seeing you again," he corrected. "I want what time remains to be spent with you as my wife, not just my childhood friend." Looking into his eyes, the same eyes that had lit with mischief when they climbed forbidden temple walls as children, Nephara found she had only one possible answer. "Yes," she whispered, bending to kiss his fevered brow. "In this life and in the field of reeds beyond, yes." The great temple of Karnak bustled with unusual activity. Word had spread. The divine pharaoh, after years of ruling alone, would at last take a bride. Few knew the complete truth, that Ramses lay dying, that the wedding represented a desperate attempt to stabilize the kingdom before chaos erupted. In a preparation chamber, attendants draped Nephara in royal garments, fine linen, gold bands, and a heavy pectoral collar of precious stones. The past days had passed in a blur, royal decrees drawn up, hushed meetings with loyal officials, and precious hours at Ramses' bedside. "It is time," Meritaten announced. "The procession forms." "There's been a complication," she added in a lower voice. "Princess Ankhesen has arrived from Kush. Her delegation entered the city at noon, claiming to bring congratulations." "I will speak with her after the ceremony," Nephara decided, privately, as one future ruler to another. The procession moved through the temple complex, priests bearing sacred standards, musicians playing, dancers scattering lotus petals. Nephara heard the whispers as she passed. "It was always her," an elderly noblewoman murmured. All these years, his heart remained fixed on the exile. "A common craftswoman as Queen of Egypt," another voice muttered disapprovingly. Near the sanctuary entrance stood the Kushite delegation. Princess Ankhesen had matured into a confident future ruler, her expression revealing nothing, as she watched Nephara approach. Inside the sanctuary, Ramses sat upon a portable throne, rather than standing as tradition demanded. Despite his obvious weakness, he straightened as Nephara approached, his eyes shining with love and determination beneath the double crown of Egypt. "My heart," he greeted her softly. "My pharaoh," she responded. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient tradition. When the high priest finally proclaimed their union complete, Ramses and Nephara turned to face the gathered nobility, who bowed in acknowledgement of her new status. "The royal couple will now process to the outer courtyard," the high priest announced. "I cannot," Ramses whispered, his voice strained. "My strength." His knees buckled. Guards prevented his collapse as physicians rushed forward. As he was transferred to a litter, Nephara held his hand, her heart constricting at the grey pallor of his face. "Forgive me," he murmured, "not the wedding day I wished to give you." As they prepared to return to the palace, a clear voice rang out, "Wait." Princess Ankhesen approached, removing a small clay vial from her robes. "My father's physician created this. It cannot cure poison that has progressed so far, but it may ease suffering and bring clarity in the time that remains." "Why?" Ramses asked simply. "Because I understand now what I did not fully grasp years ago, that some bonds transcend duty and protocol." That night, in the royal chambers, Nephara sat beside her husband of mere hours. The Kushite medicine had eased his pain, but his decline continued. "You will face challenges when I'm gone," Ramses said. "Factions that resent your sudden elevation." He gave her a heavy gold ring bearing the royal seal of Egypt. "With this you can issue commands in my name even after I am gone. Promise me you'll use it wisely. Not for revenge, not for personal gain, but for Egypt's stability." "I promise," she whispered. By all the gods and by my love for you, I will protect what you have built." As sunset painted the sky, Ramses made a final request. "Will you sing for me the river song your mother taught you?" Nephara sang softly, her voice gathering strength as the ancient melody filled the chamber. As darkness settled over Thebes, Ramses' breathing grew shallow. His fingers tightened briefly around hers before relaxing into stillness. The pharaoh was gone. When she finally rose to inform the waiting officials, Nephara moved with the measured dignity of Egypt's queen, transformed by love and loss into something greater than she had ever imagined becoming. Outside the palace, news spread through Thebes. The divine pharaoh had departed for the western lands. But unlike previous transitions, this time a queen remained, one who carried the pharaoh's authority through both marriage and royal seal. Nephara would face the future not as a frightened exile, but as Egypt's queen, transformed by love into the leader Ramses had always believed she could become. Ramses' funeral procession wound through Thebes, Queen Nephara leading in white linen and the royal vulture headdress. The people watched her with curiosity. This woman who had emerged from obscurity to stand at the center of power. After the entombment ceremony, reality descended with crushing weight. Ramses now belonged to eternity, while she faced challenges no common-born woman had ever shouldered in Egypt's history. The royal council meeting became her first test as regent. Some nobles rose in respect, while others remained seated in defiance. "Egypt stands at a crossroads," she said calmly. "For the first time in generations, no direct heir stands ready to assume the double crown." After hours of debate, a compromise emerged that recognized her regency within specific constraints. She would oversee the candidate selection process while working alongside a committee of priests and nobles. That evening, Princess Ankhesen visited her privately before departing for Kush. "They will try to control you through the selection of the next pharaoh," she warned, gifting Nephara an amulet representing alliance between female powers. As the succession ceremony approached, Nephara found herself troubled by the limited options, none worthy of Ramses' legacy. After a night of prayer at Karnak Temple, clarity came. During the ceremony, when asked to approve the three candidates, Nephara rose unexpectedly. "I do not," she stated clearly. Instead, she presented Princess Nefertari, a young woman of the royal bloodline through the female line, educated in the Temple of Hathor. "I propose that she undergo the traditional tests alongside the current candidates. Let Amun-Ra guide the choice." As each ritual test unfolded, the signs consistently favored the princess. By sunset, the impossible had become reality. Egypt would have its first acknowledged female pharaoh. Later that night, Nephara stood on her balcony overlooking the eternal Nile, holding the lapis lazuli scarab amulet. "We did it, my love," she whispered to the stars. Their story had defied every expectation, a love that proved stronger than all forces aligned against it, continuing to shape Egypt's future even after death had separated them. Ramses and Nephara's love transcended boundaries, survived separation, and transformed a kingdom. Their story reminds us that the most powerful force isn't gold or divine right. It's the connection between souls destined for each other. Which moment moved you most? The public kiss, their bittersweet reunion, or Nephara's final decision that changed Egypt forever? If this ancient love story touched your heart, subscribe now and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Turn on notifications so you won't miss our next historical romance. Did you see our previous video about lovers in medieval Scotland? Watch it next for another emotional journey that will leave you breathless. History isn't just dates. It's about people who loved fiercely and sometimes changed nations through the power of their unbreakable bond.